Yo, what's up guys? Last week I uploaded how to beat Dragon Link, and today we are back with how to beat Prankits. Last week I had a poll up on my channel where I asked you guys what do you want to see a counter of. Leave a comment down below or vote. I usually do multiple votings on my community tab each week, so if you want to participate and kind of help, getting the channel videos, then be sure to check out my community tab. And today we're going to talk about Prankits, because this is something that a lot of people figured, or at least I figured people wanted to know, and a lot of people have actually voted on it, so here we are. Now, how to beat Prankits is really how to understand Prankits. To get a little bit of a history, this deck has won a YCS before. One of the key rules in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that the moment you have to pick up your opponent's card to read it is the moment you lost. Because there is no way in hell you're gonna play it out 100% correctly. If you're not gonna be able to play it out 100% correctly, you'll never know what you're going to get. You never know what your opponent will do. And it just really ends really far from there, because their next card could be something that kills you the entire turn because you weren't ready for it. Prankits won that YCS because a talented player picked it up and started playing it, and no one knew the deck, which is really nice. I believe he also played Italian copies, so people really couldn't even pick up the cards and read them. So he really used that to his strategy to the max. And now that the deck has gotten a lot more popular, it's also kind of one of the weaknesses of the deck, because this is definitely a deck that isn't impossible to be beaten, but it's just really difficult if you don't know what it does. And the more popular the deck gets, the easier it gets to counter it. And with a video like this, I'm really hoping that it really helps as well. So to beat Prankits is to understand Prankits. Now, there are a lot of factors that you need to know, and I will talk about all of them really quickly. They have 4 main deck monsters. They have Fancies, Dropsies, Pyroses, and Roxies. They all have the same similar effect, that when they are sent to the graveyard as a link material or a fusion material, you get to do something and then summon another Prankits from your deck with a different name. Or Lemsies does 500 burn damage, Roxies banishes a card and draws a card and then summons. Fancies Foolish Burials a spell or trap, and Dropsies gains 1000 life points. So they all have a very similar effect, which is an effect that can be ashed, which is really good, because this is a normal summon reliant deck. Then they have the field spell, which searches any Prankit monster, and it also both boosts your monsters when you, I believe, fusion summon, and it reduces your opponent's attack when you link summon, or the other way around, not really sure. But they can use that to chain block in their turn, which is really something that they do a lot. They are once per turn effects, so they cannot, chain block infinitely. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Then they have the fusion spell Pandemonium, which is a quick play fusion spell. Do note that even though it's a quick play, it can only be used in the main phase. So it cannot be used in the battle phase, it cannot be used in the standby phase. So if you, chuck a Cyclone in the standby phase, then it cannot be chained, which is really nice. And it also locks them into only summoning Prankits for the rest of the turn, which is something that you also have to keep in mind as well. Then they have the recycle spell Prankits Pranks. Prankits Pranks is a card that in the end phase shuffles 3 Prankits cards back to draw a card, which helps their resource game. And in their normal main phase, they can discard a Prankits card to special summon a Prankits token to help extend that a little bit more. That card is a one-off in the deck, and it's usually only used to get more card advantage in the deck, which is really nice, and to make their resource game a little bit better, because they have a horrible resource game except for that really solid card. They have Prankits Plan, which is a trap card. They sometimes play it, sometimes they don't, but I did want to mention it because I think it's good. It's a continuous trap that lets you link summon in your opponent's turn, but usually it's not on the field. It also has a graveyard effect that when your opponent's monster declares an attack, you can shuffle any amount of Prankits cards or monsters back into your deck. Your opponent's monster loses 100 attack for each shuffled back monster. And this completely resets their resource game, and it also helps clearing out your opponent's monster that might be stronger than their Prankits. That's a card that's not really necessarily played in every list, so I did want to mention it real quick. And they have the Link 1. The Link 1 is the card that arrived the most recent out of all the Prankits, and it really helps set up their place, because they can just normal summon, link away, summon another from deck, and then they have the Link 2, and then they can continue playing. It really doesn't have any on-field effects. The most important thing is that Prankits players can banish it in your opponent's turn to not have tribute the Prankits monsters for effects. So the linked monsters and the fusion monsters all have effects that tribute themselves. Now in your opponent's turn you can banish the link one from your graveyard as a cost instead, which is really nice, because they are not, for example, the fusion is not once per turn, so then get confused they can use the fusion 2 times, but I'll talk about that later. So just keep in mind that they can vanish the link 1 in your opponent's turn as well. Then they have 2 link 2s, Bow Wow, Bark, and Cockle-Doodle-Doo. And the interesting thing is that they have like a link monster for your turn and your opponent's turn, and a fusion monster for your turn and your opponent's turn. So what Cock does is he can tribute himself to add 2 Prankets cards from your grave to your hand, which is really, really nice. And what Bow Wow Bark does is does the exact same. He adds 2 from the grave back to the hand, but he does it in your opponent's turn. So do keep in mind that they cannot use the Cock in your turn, and they can only use the Dog in your turn, but you'll learn that really easily. The Cock also has an effect that when he is special summoned, you can add a Prankets spell from your deck to your hand, so that's one of the ways that they will either add the fusion spell or add pranks. And the Dog gives something 1000 attack where he points to. Not really the most relevant, but whatever. It's a good card to end your turn on to get more resources back in your opponent's turn. Then the fusions, they have 2 fusions. They have Rocket, Ride, and they have Weather Washer. Weather Washer is really not used. Its effect is it tributes itself to special summon 2 Prankets in your opponent's turn. Rocket Ride is used because it tributes itself to special summon 2 Prankets in your turn. And it doesn't really matter what Prankets. It can be like a Lampsies or a Fancies, but it can also be a Link 2, which is really nice. They cannot summon the Link 4 or the fusion in this way. That's something to keep in mind as well, because those cannot be summoned except by a Link summon or by fusion summon. So that's something to keep in mind and pay attention to as well. Then they have the Buster, which is their boss monster. This card can be fusion summoned by using Lampsies, Fancies, and Dropsies. It cannot be summoned by Roxies, which is important to know, because there are people doing that, but it's not generic. It has to use those 3. So their entire resource game is to get those in hand or on field, or add them back in your opponent's turn and then surprise your opponent with a Buster. Now Buster has 2 effects. He contributes himself to destroy all monsters your opponent controls. Now with the link 1 in their grave, he can use that effect up to twice per turn, so Raigeki in your opponent's turn twice is really, really solid. And when he leaves the field by an opponent's card, then you can special summon a Pranket back, which is really nice because then the deck floats even more and more and more. Then they have a link 4, and he does the opposite. He destroys spells and traps, which is something that the deck can do. So even if you're playing control, you're not really safe, because in game 2 they will just make that and then end phase destroy your back row, which really sucks. So the idea of the deck is that it is a 1-card combo deck that sets itself up by adding the Pranket spells from the deck to their hand, and by fixing their hands so that in your turn they can fuse the Butler and summon more Prankets out for an entire giant wall, use the field spell to boost their monsters or reduce your monsters, and you basically get Raigeki twice in your turn and you lose. So this all sounds very, very solid, and it really, really is. There are some points that the deck can die to, which we will all talk about later. So now that you kind of had the gist of it, Prankets is a really solid deck. It's really cool, but once you know it, it's not as scary anymore, because the first 2 or 3 times you're doing it, you're like, what the hell is going on? But if you just pay attention and learn the cards, then it's actually not that bad. So the strength of the deck is that it is a 1-card combo deck, and that all the other cards in your hand can be anything. The deck can play a lot of staples. It can play Mystic Mine, it can play hand traps, it can play traps. It's a very, very diverse deck, which has a lot of options, and that's definitely what makes it strong. The weakness is that it is kind of fragile to the normal summons, because if you open 4 staples and a Prankets and the normal summon gets disrupted, you're kind of fucked, because the deck really doesn't extend that well. The only real extenders is like the polymerization, and that's kind of it. But you really want to use the polymerization to, you know, set up your board and not to have to play on. So the counter strategy to this deck is to either negate their normal summon, or you can negate the link summon, because if the link summon is negated, the Prankets are not sent to the graveyard for a link summon, because there was never a link summon and they will not trigger, which is really nice. So something like Solemn Strike on the Cockle-Doodle-Doo can be really, really good. You can also just like ash all the Prankets, like all their effects summoned from deck, so you can just ash it and then they don't summon, which is really, really nice. Now they can play through that, but it's one of the most easy ways to stop them early. Another thing is that they blow through resources really, really quick. They use like up to 4 to 5 to 6 Prankets on their turn 1 already. Then if they've used Butler in your turn, they summon 3 more from their deck. So their deck is really empty, so getting the pranks out of the way and not letting your resources be shuffled back can be something really, really nice because their extra deck is kind of limited and it's really difficult to make that second buster if the resources aren't managed right. And another very solid card against the deck is Caught by the Grave, because you can just negate, you know, the monster that tributes itself for effects, which is really, really nice. So some side / main decking options. Ash Blossom, definitely one of the MVPs against the deck, just because it can negate anything. It can negate the Spell Trap Search, but it can negate any summon from the deck, which is really, really nice. Nibiru is really good. Now, all the good Prankets players will kind of play around it, but you know, sometimes they just can't, especially if they are not expecting a Nibiru. For example, when it is in your side, they might play a little bit more reckless, and the deck definitely summons more than 5 times if they just do their normal combo and not play around it. Another card that's really good is Gamma. You can just Gamma the Link 2 and it just dies because the Link 2 isn't a quick play. So that's really, really nice. And then it removes the body from the field, and it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to play because they're missing their one extender spell, which is really, really good. Ghost Bell is really, really solid because both fusions summon monsters from the graveyard. So if they tribute their fusion to summon 2 back, then they have 0 bodies on the field if you Bell them. So Bell is something that you can really do. Now this is something a little bit more specific, but if you are playing at a locals where there's a lot of shuttle, you can also sign in Retaliating Sea, so that you can chain it to the fusion spell and then all their monsters get banished and they don't get effects. Then we also have like a card that you might be maining already or not, which is Lancia. Lancia doesn't really have applications against the Prankets, except that it, when Roxy's is sent to the grave, you banish a card from your hand, draw 1, then summon. If you don't banish, you can't summon. So that's niche. I'm not saying you should side in the Lancia, but I'm saying that it is still an option. Caught by the Grave, something you should probably be maining already. Another card very important is Cosmic Cyclone or Twin Twisters, because these are decks that do play a lot of back row, and you should definitely expect that, especially when you know you have to let them go first. They can play, like, there can be only one. They can play Ice Dragon Prison. It's also really solid to destroy their Prankets pranks or their field spell on activation, so that's something to keep in mind as well, because back row destruction is really solid against this deck, especially for the follow-up. And again, note that their fusion spell has to be in the main phase, so if you shotgun the Twin Twister in standby phase, then it's bye-bye. Another card that's really nice is Triple Tactic Talents, because when they nuke your field, the monster stays on the field, so you can just nicely steal it and link it away, or you can just use it to attack. It cannot use its effect, because it is only during your opponent's turn, so that's something to keep in mind and not cheat with. There's some other cards that might be really good are some Floodgates. We have Rivalry, Ghost and Match, Deck Lockdown, and Summon Limit. Those are all cards that are very solid, especially because this is a deck that locks itself into Prankets easy, and with not the right hand, they might not be able to extend into making something like a Nightmare Phoenix. And if they make a Nightmare Phoenix, then the Prankets all don't trigger. So that's also really, really nice. So keep in mind that Prankets isn't impossible to beat. This deck definitely has its flaws and its weakness. You can just Ash and they might just pass turn. And if they extend further, then be aware that they have locked themselves with the fusion spell easy. Yeah, just take your time against the deck, learn the deck, get to know it. Read all the cards once so you properly understand what's going on. Because all these cards are all once per turn. They're all really fair actually, which is really nice. And it's all like the same combo of adding monsters back to your hand or summoning monsters back to then special summon the fusion monster. But the fusion monster has very specific materials, so it's really easy to work around that. I want to give a quick shout out to Rowan for helping me make up this list. I sent him a message, how do you beat Prankets? He said, look at your opponent angry and say, no, this is not what I want. So shout out to Rowan for helping me out with this video. He's definitely one of the Prankets experts that I know. I want to thank you guys for watching this video. I hope that this was very useful for you, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye guys.